In a cemetery in St. Louis, at least 6 Filipinos are buried. They died at the 1904 World's Fair. Janna Añonuevo Langholz started searching for their graves in 2021 after reading about them in archival newspapers.
Well, I think they deserve to be remembered. This whole investigation began in February 2022 when I came across Janna's Instagram, and I was going to write about her work to find the places that these people were buried. And then she shared a record with me that said 4 of those people had their brains removed and taken to the Smithsonian. Once I heard about the Filipino aspect of this story, I got really interested in working with Claire on this.
Langholz's discovery would inspire a year-long investigation into the Smithsonian's collections of human remains.
I had already been researching Filipinos that were part of this exhibit, like put on exhibition, who had died at the 1904 World's Fair. And I came across a catalog online from the Smithsonian. They had listings of things that they had acquired from St. Louis, either during or after the fair. And then I asked the Smithsonian, how many brains do you have and why? And they sent me a spreadsheet of all the brains that they have with locality and what's called an accession number. I went to the Smithsonian Institution archives and took each of these numbers and got the original accession cards. So these are the cards that are filed away every time a new body part was entered into a collection at the Smithsonian. And we built up a database of those. There were children in the collection. There were men and women, and then fetuses. Many of them were Indigenous people, other people of color, and many of them didn't have their identities actually recorded, partly because they were looked at as specimens.
The Smithsonian currently has 255 human brains in a storage facility in Maryland. Records suggest only 4 of those brains were collected with consent.
Wanted them to go and physically count how many brains are still in their...
The reporters took their findings to a team of editors and other journalists at the Post.
And there might be even more brains.
We wanted to try to see if we could get the thousands of files that involved human remains, not just brains. I knew if we can get the raw documents, it could tell us a lot more. I had thousands of PDFs, and most of it was handwritten, and so I had to use Google Document AI to kind of first translate that into text. I then trained a model, pull out the name, pull out addresses, pull out details. And in the end, we have this big working spreadsheet, and we could see which of those files included names from Hrdlicka.
Ales Hrdlicka led the Physical Anthropology Division at the U.S. National Museum, now called the National Museum of Natural History. He managed the brain collection until he died in 1943. The Post found that of the more than 30,000 human remains the museum still holds, over 60% were collected while Hrdlicka was head of the division.
Ales Hrdlicka is referred to some as the father of physical anthropology. He just had an obsession with collecting body parts and bodies.
These are all the measurements he did of Native American people.
So that they can learn more about human evolution, but also to try and figure out the difference between races. And so we were able to see in his own papers about how, really excited he was to be collecting from so many people all over the world.
These are letters between him and someone named Frank P. Mall at Johns Hopkins. And he writes him and says, I wish to ask you if you could possibly aid me in obtaining the bodies of 2 newborn black children, a boy and a girl, and 2 white American children, also a boy and a girl.
Of the brains taken within the U.S., the largest racial group represented are Black people. So when Hrdlicka was starting his collection,
He began by taking the brains of people locally. There are about 74 brains of people from the DC area. Going through Hrdlicka's papers, it was extremely evident that he was extremely racist. We also found his connections to eugenics.
Without citing any of his own evidence or studies, he would state that
white brains showed some superiority to black brains.
As the Post investigated, the Natural History Museum restricted access to human remains and hired 2 researchers to look into ethical returns.
They are searching for a new place to store the brains because currently they're stored with the remains of other animals.
The Smithsonian also formed a task force to develop a new human remains policy.
We talked to the Smithsonian Secretary, Lonnie Bunch III, and he apologized for the unethical way that many of these remains were collected.
As a historian, I know that so much of this has been based on racist attitudes. So I understand that that is just really unconscionable. All the remains, all the brains need to be returned if possible.
I think that the question we've been trying to prioritize is who were these people who had their brains taken. Janna sparked this search for Maura.
Maura was a Kankanai Igorot woman from Siuk, a community 200 miles north of Manila. She was one of more than 1,000 Filipinos who came to St. Louis in 1904 to be put on display at the World's Fair. Before the fair opened, she died from pneumonia.
So I must wonder if it's this set the tone.
Reporters worked with visual editors and a Filipino artist to illustrate Maura's story. Langholz read about Maura in archival newspapers and searched for her grave for over a year.
And then what really stood out to me at this point when I saw it is that where it says buried at, it's blank.
In July 2022, the Smithsonian told Langholz that the cerebellum of a Siuk Igorot had likely been incinerated. Museum records did not name Maura, and one said the cerebellum belonged to a male. But because she was the only known person from Siuk who died at the fair, Langholz believed the brain belonged to Maura.
After everything she had already been through, and that I had been through looking for her, it was the worst news that I think I could have ever gotten.
Because the Smithsonian didn't record Maura's names in any of their records, there is still a question about whether the cerebellum really belongs to Maura. From the records that we saw, we know that Hrdlicka went to St. Louis in 1904 and collected the brains of Filipinos at the World's Fair.
The Post reviewed thousands of records, including death certificates, Smithsonian inventories, academic studies, fair correspondence, newspapers, and photographs. The research revealed the cerebellum, taken by Ales Hrdlicka in 1904, was likely Maura's.
This story, this comic, this reporting is partially about our journey to identify these brains. And also it's our reporting on Janna's discoveries and her efforts to locate these people who had their brains taken and try to correct this in some way. And including that in the comic, you see that this may have happened over 100 years ago, but there are a lot of people today who are reconciling with this, trying to make it right, and doing that is a very complicated process.